So my name's Elaine Graham-Leigh. I'm an author and activist on issues of climate change for more years than I care to count. And I have to admit, if you told my younger self that I would still be talking about what we need to do to get real action on climate crisis when I started, I would have been very disheartened. So it's probably a good thing that nobody did. So we've got a fantastic range of speakers for you for this session. We've got Jane Hammett, who is from Save Oglet Shore. We've got Matthew T. Huber, who is the author of a new book, Climate Change is Class War, which I've just read and reviewed, and it's absolutely fantastic. I recommend everyone to go out as soon as this session finishes and buy that and read that. And Ed Gommon from Zero Carbon Liverpool. So let's kick off with Jane. I believe you're going first.
I don't know.
Go first.
Okay, I'll go first. I did have a number of slides that, but I'm sure I can talk without the slides. I
think you can just share your screen, Jane. I've got the option.
I am a technical Luddite, and I sent my slides to Ken, and he was going to do that. So I will just say survive without my slides. Just my words will fill that in. Okay, just so people know, I've been campaigning against Liverpool Airport since 2018. So what I want to do is basically tell you why, what is at risk, and I'm going to go on to give the plans that Liverpool Airport planned for this 102 acres of greenbelt. I'm going to describe our enemy, which is Peel Holdings, who are the villains in a lot of the Northwest in terms of development. They're the worst sort of capitalist firm, private company. I'm going to talk about the plans they have, the master plans they have. I think people will be interested in our fight back, how we've engaged with the local community. Even though I sound like a southerner, most of our supporters, a lot of our supporters are Speakites, which is a very deprived working class area of Liverpool. So, and I'll bring you up to date with our campaign if you'll allow me to do that. What's the kind of, is it around about 10 minutes, Elaine? I'll try and be fairly brief. Okay, there is 102 acres. Right. That's not in the right order, but never mind. This is our latest banner because we had some concentration on the poor air quality in the area of Speak. And we have a couple of filmmakers. We had a demonstration of that child. People were wearing masks and they tied themselves to the airport perimeter fence. That's our latest banner. Anyway, so what is at risk? Well, it's 102 acres. It is between the airport runway and the Mersey estuary. It was greenbelt and it was 102 acres, but the greenbelt protection has been removed. The Mersey, the River Mersey is what's called a Ramsar site, so it's of international importance in terms of wetland birds. But not only that, the area is it's very productive. It's classed as the most productive farmland in this category in this country. It's also a green lung. The area is very polluted. The life expectancy is a lot lower than most of the areas of Liverpool. During the pandemic, it was a very important green open space, heavily used by the people of Speak, who have suffered such a lot of loss of parks, playing fields, open spaces. So it was heavily used during the pandemic. But what was important to me, what started me as an activist, is the fact that it's very important habitat. There are owls, there are even otters there. It's one of the only two places in Liverpool where barn owls are nesting. The swallows return there every year, etc. Okay, I'm sure you're probably on side with that. Okay, what Peel proposed is a runway extension to the east, which is going into Hale Village, to the west, which is going to be by Speak Hall, which is a National Trust property. Extension of runway, logistics. There's going to be a new road which would actually sandwich the council, or the large estate of Speak, between two major roadways. And so that's basically the plan. It was going to cost 100 million to develop. This plan was supported by Liverpool City Council local plan. Part of the area is in Holton. It was also approved in the local plan of Holton Council. The two independent government inquiries into the local plans both could have ratified. They said, yes, go ahead. If we think that's fine. So it was actually sort of backed by both, even though we gave evidence why it wasn't feasible. It was backed also by, sorry, I've got rats. It's just a rat on my step there. It was backed by Mayor Anderson. He's a disgraced Liverpool mayor. It was a vanity project with him, and also the Liverpool what's it called, Rotherham, who is the regional mayor, also backed it in terms of jobs. Okay, so that it was basically backed by the whole council. That's what we were up against. Okay. Who is the villain in the piece? Now, Ed will know very well about Peel Holdings. Now, Peel Holdings are a private company. They have around about 37 million acres in the northwest. They see things in the long term. They bought, for example, the ship canal years and years ago. People said, "Why are you buying the ship canal?" Because of the land either side, it's increased in value to a great extent. They own the Trafford Centre. They own Media City in Salford. They are the majority owners of Peel Ports. As I said, they're a private company. They have the head of it, Whitaker family. He's a tax exile in the Isle of Man. They hold their finances in the Cayman Islands and Guernsey for tax efficient purposes. I'm told I can't say the tax avoidance. They basically they're very good taking advantage of public subsidies for things like Media City and the development of Salford. But they don't give anything back to the community. They siphon all the money out. The Public Accounts Committee came and looked at them. I think it was Margaret Hodge actually. And she found a myriad of shell companies that are very secretive to actually find out, where the money is being sort of secreted around. They're actually, this will come in later in the discussion, they are asset rich, but cash poor. That's why they need to exploit, especially in these straitened times, they need to exploit the land that they have control of. And the land, which this 102 acres was gifted to them by Liverpool Council a number of years ago on a 999-year lease. So they're desperate to develop it. Peel have a PR company called Turley. And basically what our group, our campaign, when we had a look at the master plan for this development, Dr. Lawrence Jones, he's forensic sort of, investigating into this, and he found out that the master plan is actually full of lies, which were swallowed by our politicians, hook, line, and sinker. Lies about exaggerated passenger numbers, exaggerated contribution to the local economy, grossly exaggerated promise of 6,000 jobs. So basically, the expansion was based on lies. They lied about consultation with the local people as well. We found out when we could have examined the consultation papers that they'd actually got around about 96 written responses, and it's a very large community. So they lied about the level of consultation. They are the favourites. Financially, they are in a very bad position. It's very difficult to find out what Liverpool John Lennon Airport debt is. It runs into the millions. They were the reason that Liverpool bought in some shares a number of years ago. they bought 10% of the shares. It's basically a bailout. And during the pandemic, they were, Rotherham, the Metro Mayor, gave them 34 million of public money, which bailed them out again. They are in difficult financial position. So 45% of the shares a couple of years ago were bought by Anne Carla. This one at the moment is our first demonstration. These are mostly people from Speak. This is our very first demonstration. 45% of the shares in the airport are owned by Anne Carla, who are an investment company. And the only reason why, and I've described to you, I hope you can understand that this is a failing airport, does not need to expand. It's laden with debt. So why would investment company buy into it? It's basically because of the value of the land. They've already got the removal of Greenbelt through, and also they have put plans in for solar panels, etc. But they hope to exploit the land, and that's what we know. If I could say, it's almost like shadow boxing. So in front of us is a master plan that says we want to expand the airport. We know that Peel has not got the money, the 100 million to expand the airport. What we knew from the start, is basically it's a land grab. They want to kind of occupy, develop the land, as they've done on either side of the ship canal. And in the future, they're land banking. In the future, the land will be worth a lot more, and it'll be developed, and Peel will benefit. You learn about a company by their past behaviour. There is a playing field in Speak. Used to belong to Dunlop's, and they said that this was necessary. It was vital for airport development. It's now housing. It's a housing estate from Barrett's. Doncaster Airport, the Teesside Airport, they used to own that. It became unviable. They sold it back to the council, which is what they're doing with their other airport, which is Doncaster Sheffield, but not before they'd had planning permission for about 350 houses. So basically, that's what they're doing. You might be interested in what we've done as a fight back. I'm a gardener. I'm there every day. I have contact. I've got friends in Speak, etc. But it's a deprived area, Speak. And there was difficulty in actually getting any response. So the first thing we did was set up a Facebook page. It's grown and grown and grown.
Sorry, Jane, would you mind winding up?
Yes, sorry. It's the most important bit of fight back, but I'll try it, Elaine, do it very quickly. So we had a Facebook page, we had demos, we've had poetry books, we've had socials, we've had 4 different leaflets. We've had films and songs made, etc. What happened, we tried to get support from the MP, Angela Eagle, not interested at all. She betrayed us. She voted for the 3rd runway at Heathrow. None of the councillors were interested. They actually refused information about the development. We gave evidence at the 2 local plan inquiries, who ignored our evidence completely and ratified the development. 52 acres already been enclosed with a deliberately misleading planning application from the airport. Nothing's happened about that. Just winding up now. Liverpool declared a climate emergency in 2019. And then the president, the new mayor, got, it's Liverpool Carbon Zero. Ed will be talking about that, I presume. And that basically made a nonsense of the fact that they were backing an airport expansion. We presented a petition, we sent emails to every councillor, every member of the cabinet was making a decision. We had a demonstration and we got an agreement from the council that they would review the policy. At present, we are waiting on the date for a meeting with Harry Doyle, who is the tourism and travel and tourism councillor, and somebody else. So that's where we are at the moment. Elaine, sorry to go over.
That's okay. Thanks very much, Jane. So next I'm going to bring in Matt Huber. So over to you, Matt.
All right. Can you all hear me now?
Yep, that's
great.
great.
Let me share. So I know Monty Python, they say now for something very different. And I'm just going to give a kind of overview of this book that just came out. And I think hopefully this kind of sort of general overview might have some resonance with the types of struggles Jane was talking about and I know is featured in this event. So thanks to Elaine and Ken and the other organizers, Ali, for having me at this cool event. So briefly, there's an emerging consensus that climate change is a problem of class inequality. But how do we understand that problem? Perhaps the most prominent analyst of inequality, Thomas Piketty, asserts via his research that the top 10% of carbon emitters have comparable emissions to the bottom 50% of the world who have the lowest carbon emissions. His findings echo recent studies by Oxfam on extreme carbon inequality and others. A recent analysis from the Cambridge Sustainability Commission basically comes to a basic recommendation, quote, far-reaching changes in lifestyles are required to avoid dangerous levels of carbon or global heating. What these studies share is they use something called carbon footprint accounting, a concept that was itself made up by British Petroleum in 2004. And they use this tool to kind of attribute emissions to consumption and lifestyle practices of everyone from a Wall Street executive with a private jet to a poor subsistence farmer in Kenya. All individuals using this method are seen as wholly responsible for the emissions embedded in their consumption practices. Now, although this way of thinking about carbon inequality is quite entrenched in academic and policy circles, there are major problems with it. From this point of view, a Hollywood actor with a large house and sports utility vehicle is more responsible for climate change than a fossil fuel executive who lives in an apartment, takes public transit, and is a vegetarian. Now, that same fossil fuel executive might, the owners of this airport and the investors interested in the land is kind of an interesting angle there. So when we only focus on the consumption and lifestyles of the rich, we miss their role as owners and investors that are wrapped up in even more destructive systems of production. In other words, we miss how they generate the money that makes their consumption possible in the first place. And if consumers are responsible for 100% of emissions, what about the actors who provision their consumption? When we consume gasoline, we do indeed create, or petrol, as you would say, we do indeed create emissions, but oil corporations sold us the fuel. We might simply be trying to get to work, but they operate entire carbon-intensive businesses and hope to continue to do so deep into this century. So which actor along this commodity chain deserves more blame for the climate crisis, the consumer or the owner and producer? So this brings us to the concept underneath our idea of inequality, which is class. These studies understand class simply as one's income and wealth or consuming power. Yet an older socialist understanding of class defines it as your relationship to the means of production. This class analysis locates a tiny minority of society that owns and controls production for profit, what you could call the capitalist class, while the majority of society, the working class, owns very little more than their labor, which they have to sell on a market for a wage in order to survive. From this perspective, it's clear enough that the working class has very little power to shape the actual organization of the energy system at the heart of our climate crisis. That power is firmly in the hands of the CEOs and owners and boards of directors of fossil fuel industries, electric utility industries, steel industries, cement, chemicals, and other carbon-intensive industries. So this kind of seemingly outdated conception of class as rooted in the means of production, I would argue, is really very relevant to the climate crisis, because actually when you look at the responsibility for emissions at a global level, the biggest contributor is actually industrial production. And I would add in this chart here that this category, agricultural, forestry, and other land use, is other forms of production in rural agricultural areas. So production is the key driver of the climate crisis. So this class analysis presents a much simpler, though perhaps more difficult political equation, a different vision of class struggle. Rather than a moral project of transforming the behaviors of millions of dispersed consumer lifestyles, solving climate change actually requires confronting the power of a smaller group of owners who control and profit from carbon-intensive production. Like countless historical examples, to confront concentrated economic power, we're going to need an actually broad-based political, social movement to pull this off. And if we aim to solve that crisis democratically, we also need a climate politics that really appeals to the vast majority of working people in our highly unequal neoliberal capitalist society. So here we come to another class problem in our climate politics. It's almost completely driven by what I call the professional class. Now, this class uses advanced degrees and other credentials to carve out advantages in the labor market. You can think this class includes people like scientists, journalists, nonprofit staffers, government workers, college students. And these are the types of people that really dominate the climate space or the climate advocacy networks. Yet the professional class mode of climate advocacy is often ill-suited to actually appeal to the wider majority of the population. For one, I'm using statistics from the United States, but it's probably similar in the UK. It's about 22% of the workforce that is in these professional occupations. And that's also shrinking as these occupations become harder to obtain. In the United States, broadly speaking, 37% of the population lacks a college degree. So, 37% of the population has a college degree, meaning 63% lacks one. So the professional class of highly educated, credentialed people is not really a majoritarian basis for this movement. Another problem is this class tends to see the climate struggle as largely a fight over knowledge of accepting the science or belief in denial of the science. And while that science is increasingly terrifying, it's hard to imagine how a scientific understanding can really reach and resonate with more everyday, immediate material concerns of the masses. So if those of you remember across the channel, when the Yellow Vest movement went into revolt, they had this line: politicians are concerned with the end of the world, but we are concerned with the end of the month. Furthermore, since the professional class project is inherently about kind of obtaining middle-class security, they can enjoy some degree of material comfort, things like home and car ownership and professional expectations of air travel. I argue this creates an overwhelming anxiety and what I call carbon guilt as the world burns. So rather than focus on those that have the real power to control and profit off our energy system, the owners, professionals blame themselves and think their consumption is really the core driver of climate breakdown. This means professional class climate politics often centers on what I call politics of less, about lowering your footprint, lowering consumption, and degrowth. Again, it's easy to see why this politics of less has little chance of resonating with the broader working class. In the United States, about 64% of people live paycheck to paycheck. Nearly a third are struggling to afford utility bills. I know in the UK, there's a massive cost of living crisis, and there's a lot of social movements sort of wrapped up in saying enough is enough to this. But on the other hand, this kind of politics of less is really not going to speak to the needs of the broader majority of working people. And it doesn't help that a lot of the so-called solutions to the climate crisis, like electric vehicles and putting solar panels on your roof, are actually quite expensive and unaffordable for the larger working class. It's not as if professional class style climate politics is the only problem on this particular issue. Many analysts have observed that there's this larger political process going on of what they call educational polarization. So Thomas Piketty again, David Shore have shown how center-left parties across the industrialized world that used to be the party of the working class are now finding their support only among a shrieking set of highly educated, affluent voters. It is professionals who drive these party apparatuses, build the campaigns and messaging that often alienate the wider working classes and drive them to the rights, which we all can see every day. You know, what happened in Sweden, what's happening in Italy right now, we're seeing this process. So it had seemed that in 2019, we had started to figure this out. The climate movement had, at least. Movements around a Green New Deal felt like we should center or connect climate policy to issues of broader inequality and the material concerns of the broader working class. So focusing climate action on green housing, a job guarantee, and in our barbaric country, Medicare for all, free healthcare for all.
2 minutes, Matt?
Yeah, I'm just about to end. In the United States, again, this is a partial story. Once the Democratic Party got in power, they actually went back to what I would call sort of a professional class playbook of trying to pass like very technocratic policy fixes for the climate crisis. There was a lot of excitement around something called the Clean Electricity Performance Program that would have cleaned up the electricity sector, but it had no real visible material gain that it offered for the larger working class. And of course, we know the Biden administration has sort of steadfastly announced that this is just a crisis that the private sector is going to involve. They were able to pass this Inflation Reduction Act, but ultimately that is a bunch of tax credits, and it's essentially a continuation of a market policy that just hopes, if we get the right incentives out there, that market actors, whether consumers or investors, will just make the right climate decisions freely on the market with no coercion, no planning, no coordinated, people have been calling for like a coordinated public investment program like a Green New Deal. So basically, the window of opportunity for this Green New Deal, I think we should admit, kind of passed with the Bernie and Corbyn movements, but we have to kind of keep our eye on the ball and try to think about how can we build a mass climate program that really seeks to offer mass public goods, universal benefits for the working class. And if we do so, we might actually be able to finally create a kind of mass popular climate politics that can build the power that we need to take on the fossil fuel industry and the capitalists responsible for the crisis.
Thanks very much, Matt. So I'm going to go straight on to our next speaker, who is Ed Gommon from Zero Carbon Liverpool. So over to you, Ed.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. So my slides, I think Ali's going to share them, but they're not really relevant, so they'll just be kind of ticking away in the background. But they are kind of relevant, but they're not. Don't pay too much attention to them. Okay, thanks for having me. So as a climate activist, and as we're all, I guess, climate activists here, socialists, eco-socialists, if you will, we are confronted with the difficult problem of how to bring about eco-socialism and avoid climate apocalypse hell world, as I like to call it, which is where we're currently on the trajectory towards. Unfortunately, this problem is made more difficult by two factors. Global warming's terrifying maths. So I was pleased to see a picture of old Bill McKibben there on your slides there, Matt, and what Kevin Anderson calls the brutal beauty of the physics. Essentially, the carbon budget we have left to play with to give us a fighting chance to stay anywhere close to 1.5 degrees of warming, and the time frame with which we must get to net zero. Globally, we have till 2050 to get to net zero, by which I mean like genuine net zero, not pretend net zero, and around 800 billion tons of carbon dioxide is the budget we've got. So, well, that was the budget in 2015. Apparently now it's more like 650 billion tons. And the Tyndall Centre estimates that for the UK, getting to net zero by 2040, like for the UK, that means getting to net zero by 2040, which is good because Liverpool City region has a 2040 net zero target and a 2040 net zero plan, although it's not very well elucidated at the moment in terms of what the actions actually are to reach that. Liverpool City Council, on the other hand, thinks they can do that job by 2030, which is, optimistic, which is pretty good. So yeah, it's all of it kind of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will at the moment in terms of the climate activism. I think we have to imagine we have to have a politics that imagines another way of living, but we also need to implement what we imagine really quickly. all the way through my time trying to do something about climate, there's been a recognition that what we need to do to the transition that will occur will necessarily lead to a kind of a post-capitalist solution. And the block on effective action to dealing with the climate emergency is mainly down to vested interests of the capitalist class. I'm not an academic, and I won't cover the global scale other than what I've said already. For me, the climate emergency is too big and overwhelming to do that. So I kind of focus on local actions that people have taken, including myself, have taken, the arguments for them and their limitations, and just talk about the current situation, how that could change. I want to thank Matt for his excellent book. I have read it. I did read it before I was supposed to come on this panel, so it's good. I thought it a really useful contribution. In particular, I like this idea of the working class is alienated from its life conditions and dependent on the market for the essentials of life. So it's like food and water, housing and energy, which I put together as well, clothing, healthcare, transport, and this idea of a proletarian ecology seeks to extricate the working class from the market through a process of decommodification. So I'll try and relate those themes to kind of what I've been up to over the last decade or so. My journey began in 2008 and 2009 with an initial dalliance with Transition Town, which some of you may recognise in the UK. I'm not sure if it's a thing in the US, and which at the time included a bit of peak oilism, plus a bit more radical stuff like protest things like Climate Camp, and also joining the Green Party as well. But don't hold that against me. My first serious attempts to do anything about the climate crisis was getting involved in setting up a housing cooperative. We were going to try and renovate empty properties, or thousands of empty properties in Liverpool at the time when I came back, and turn them into sort of super eco-efficient houses with their own energy supply. So this would be about decommodifying housing and taking control of our own energy needs. And I live in a housing cooperative now. It's like a proper housing cooperative, not just a house share, 138 units. And I'm still trying to convince the committee that making the houses more energy efficient and getting energy from renewables and decarbonising the heating is something we need to look at, and I'm making some progress with that. So things are moving in the right direction in some ways, although it's taken far too long. In general, those projects ended in frustration and failure. So the next thing I tried was community energy, which is so effectively an energy cooperative for community renewables. There was a viable business model at the time based on generating electricity from solar panels, getting revenue from the government subsidy that existed at the time, known as the feed-in tariff. However, in 2016, just as we were getting going, the government slashed the feed-in tariff and basically made it impossible to develop onshore wind. So that again was taking democratic control of a decarbonised, decentralised energy supply, and how you could kind of take over that situation. Luckily, however, even though that failed, the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn was finally taking the climate emergency seriously and putting together policies that effectively constituted a Green New Deal, building on previous trade union work that had produced the 1 billion climate jobs programme. So I left the Green Party, joined up with some comrades and climate activists who wanted to make the most of this opportunity, and we set up Labour for a Green New Deal, Merseyside group. So kind of working with the Labour for a Green New Deal kind of national group. We ran events and we wrote a manifesto for what a Green New Deal would look like locally in the city and the city region. And then we lost the 2019 election and the pandemic happened. So I'm still trying to make things happen. I'm currently working on an onshore wind turbine project in South. I'm running carbon neutral quarters. All the small scale stuff that I've kind of talked about was always intended to be a pilot that could be an example that could then be scaled up, like as the situation changed. So, for example, community energy could become municipal energy. That was always the motivation behind it. That was always the kind of hope behind it. As time's gone on, like yourself, Elaine, I started in 2008, 2009, and I assumed things would have changed a lot more by the time we got here. But as more data comes in and less and less stuff happens, and the situation gets worse and worse, it becomes increasingly obvious that state power is the only thing that's really going to accomplish this transition. However, as we've seen, that avenue kind of closed off for now. It's difficult to see what we can do next, especially if Labour lose the next election, whatever that is. The problem is we don't really have time to wait. So I remember particularly reading the Million Climate Jobs, the programme that the unions have put together, their kind of booklet that they put together, and being at an event with them and speaking to them and saying, okay, so this was like probably in 2012 or something like this. or 13 and saying like, okay, so we're not in power, and this does kind of seem to presuppose that you have a government in power that's going to implement this. In the meantime, what do we do? Because we can't just wait. And they didn't really have an answer to that. So given the current situation that we face, a massive cost of living crisis, especially around energy, I think the opportunity is there to make an argument for massive government intervention, for retrofitting the UK housing stock and investing in renewables. However, I don't trust the Tories to implement that policy. The unions are leading the fight on this with the enough is enough stuff. But to be fair, although Labour has watered down its 2017 to 2019 Green New Deal policies, they apparently do have some decent commitments in there. I haven't read the detail of what they've announced yet. But one of my concerns is about building a movement and building working class power is that it takes time. There are no shortcuts. We have a very narrow window, rapidly diminishing, of how we get to net zero. The other is a massive jobs program that transforms the energy system and retrofits all the houses and create good, well-paid union jobs, could lead to like a consumer boom of like high carbon emissions, carbon consumptions. That could be an issue if we kind of succeed to like rebound, I think they call it. I think there is a place for individual action, even as we mobilise and organise for systemic change. Obviously, the emphasis isn't on people for people on lower incomes who already have relatively small carbon footprints. 10% of the world's population, the richest 10%, I assume, activities account for 50% of the global carbon emissions. So we need to focus on reducing their carbon emissions first. And I think we do need a mass education program. It doesn't have to be too detailed. I mean, the carbon literacy training I run, like 8 hours, 6 to 8 hours long, so it's like a day's training. But I think if people need to understand and be willing participants in the transition, or it won't happen. So the future we want to create has to offer people a better life, but that will be constrained by planetary boundaries like the carbon budget we have left. And I think I think for me, responding to Matt, that's my kind of response to Matt is what you're proposing. I totally agree with, but there is this barrier. There are these limits that you have to work. So it's not we can just offer people whatever they want. There's strict limits on what can be offered, and there are constraints that we're working under. So that's what I've got to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Ed. So we have, I think, about 3/4 of an hour or so to talk about these points among ourselves. And I don't know if anyone actually in the living room in the Future of the Left is going to join the discussion as well. But I get to kick off, I think, the discussion just to respond to some of those points. And I think it's been a fantastic discussion so far. And it seems to me that what we're all talking about in different ways is this key question of power. And I think it's really important because often, when we have these discussions about climate change, we kind of float around this issue and don't often take it on head on in many ways. But it is absolutely fundamental. I mean, that question about whether we are fighting for systemic change at the level of national or international system, or whether we're looking for things that you can do without that kind of government action, I think is absolutely key. And I think we have to recognise actually how much that has shaped not just what climate campaigners do, but actually what we think of as being priorities. So an area that I did some work in a few years ago about food and food's contribution to climate change and so on. I mean, that very much you can track actually the extent to which people think that food is important against the graph of what people thought the issue was. When it was understood as an issue about production methods and about distribution, it wasn't seen as very important. The percentage of carbon emissions that it contributes didn't change. But when it became something that people saw something about people's individual choice to eat a specific type of food as opposed to a different type of food, it then becomes incredibly important to a lot of people's activism. Once it's something that you can deal with by sitting down in the dairy aisle in the supermarket, as opposed to taking on enormous companies and capitalist distribution systems, it suddenly seems like, okay, that's something that we can do because it's about individual behavior. So I think it's really important to understand how that debate about whether we're thinking about systems or whether we're thinking about individual behavior has really shaped our understanding. And I think this is true actually even when we're thinking about the energy sector. I mean, Ed, you talked a bit about sort of community energy projects and that sort of thing. And I think often on the left, that sounds like, okay, that's the way to go. I remember this was actually featured quite heavily in the 2017 Labour manifesto, because I remember having arguments with people about it. And the thing is, it kind of, it sounds all very kind of, this is stuff that socialists should support because it's all co-op-y and so on. But I think the problem is that can be a failure to actually really want to take on the vested interest and to really think on that national and international level that we need to do. It's kind of, it's even in the Corbyn's 2017 manifesto. It's a kind of, well, we can't really take on the structures of power here, so we'll just kind of do this one community microgrid at a time. So it's in a sense, it is to an extent an abrogation of responsibility there, and it also, of course, isn't going to be as effective because, of course, as we know, there are issues with intermittency with renewables, and the smaller you make your grid, the more that you give yourself that problem of intermittency, because it's almost always windy or sunny somewhere. But not if your microgrid is 3 streets, because there's plenty of days when in the 3 streets that I live in, it's neither windy nor sunny. So, that is kind of a demonstration really about how this kind of thinking on this, well, we can't change the system, so we'll just work at the level that we can change, actually means we're looking at less effective solutions. And I think our responsibility as socialists is to take this on head on, and I don't think that it's about waiting to elect a government that can do this. But interestingly, I think even if we had a Corbyn government, we would have that would have been the beginning of the fight, not the end of the fight. We would have had a mass movement on the streets to make sure that what was in the manifestos was implemented and to go beyond those manifestos, as I've just said. So in a way, and I think that's doubly, triply true for a Starmer government, but it's also true of a Tory government. I mean, if you think, I think it is very much looking like Liz Truss will be the shortest lived and most disastrous Tory Prime Minister in history, since they were already, you may not be up with this, but she's been Prime Minister for 3 weeks, 2 weeks, something like that, and apparently Tory MPs are already putting in letters of no confidence in her. So it's quite spectacular, this side of the pond. But also, I mean, and this was true of Johnson's government as well, that actually they're very vulnerable to pressure. I mean, if you think about the government stepping in on their energy bills. I mean, what they've put in place is obviously insufficient, and we have all sorts of criticisms of it. But Liz Truss, when she was doing her leadership campaign, she wasn't going to do anything. I mean, the only reason that they put anything in is because they're afraid of public pressure if they don't. So we shouldn't just think just because it's Tory government that we can't build a mass movement that can force them to do things that they don't want to do, because we've shown actually that we can. But we do have to be building that mass movement. And I think the key thing here is that what we're talking about, I think, is not building a new mass movement on the climate. I think as socialists, I'm sure we will all agree that the problems of environmental destruction, which goes actually beyond just simply climate change, it is a problem of capitalism. So movements that are taking on capitalism, that are taking on seizing that key link in the chain, in a sense, to defeat the neoliberal government, are also fighting on climate change, even if they're not necessarily enormously explicit about that. So rather than saying, okay, we're going to add yet another mass demonstration to your busy schedule, in a sense, what I think we need to be doing is maximising the movement that we've already got about austerity, about the cost of living crisis, and so on. Because if, say, People's Assembly can inflict massive defeats on the government, actually what they're calling for will actually enormously help the climate, but it is also calling for things that will actually materially help working class people's lives now. Which, as Matt so eloquently put it in his talk and in his book, is what we need to be doing. We are not going to be able to build a mass movement based on people demonstrating to immiserate themselves. I don't know how anyone in the Green movement ever got themselves in a position where they thought that was realistic, but clearly that is not going to happen. And I think we need, And it is partly, I think, because the Green Movement has taken that, some people in the Green Movement have taken that view, that we've ended up with a situation where an awful lot of people feel that Greens are just middle class, know-nothing people who are just trying to guilt working class people into making their already difficult lives even more difficult. And you have that chasm in some places between Green activists and working class people, which I think we are beginning to overcome. I mean, I don't know if any of you were able to be in Glasgow last year for the COP26 protests, but that was really, really encouraging. The number of trade union banners on the big Glasgow demonstration in the pouring rain last November, that was really good. And it felt, I've been on an awful lot of climate change demonstrations in my life, and there have been a very large number of them that are just tooth-achingly posh. And you have far too many people calling to their kids who are called Tristan and Isolde and getting their packed lunch out of Waitrose bags and things. And it's all just very depressing. And the COP demonstration was just not like that. And that felt to me like we are making progress. But what we absolutely have to do is build that movement on the basis of unity. So, I mean, enough is enough is great, but they're not talking to the People's Assembly. They're not talking to the other campaigns out there. We have to make sure that we are one movement, because we do not have time for sectarianism. We have time, I think, to build the mass movement, but we don't have time to build several. We haven't talked very much here about the trade unions, and I think the trade unions, particularly in high carbon industries, are going to be absolutely key here. And I'm aware I don't have all that much time to talk about trade unions right now, but I think we obviously have to do a lot more than just talk about just transition. I mean, obviously, just transition is absolutely key, but we need to be finding a way so that the workers who are actually in those industries can sit down themselves and work out themselves what needs to happen to those industries, and therefore what they can fight for. Because I think the thing is, even within the unions, it's beginning to happen, but it's not happening in the right place. So in my union, Unite, we have a new sort of climate caucus that's just sort of getting going to talk about these things, which is great. But it's mostly Unite community members and people like me who work in offices. It's not mostly the workers who are Unite members, who are actually in the nuclear industry, in the aviation industry, in the road haulage industry. And it doesn't really help if it's people like me who work by tapping away at a computer all day, telling people in those industries what they should be doing, because that really is just what we've been trying to do for 20 years and it doesn't work. So I think there's a lot more work to be done there in those unions, which needs to be getting them away from the thinking that, okay, it's just about defending members' jobs in the industries as they are right now, and the only way to defend members' jobs is to keep the industries as they are right now. Which I think is still a battle, and we need to be doing that industry by industry. And part of what we need to do is to work out how we do that. So I think I'd be really interested to hear what you guys think about that. But I think in general, I think the more that we can have these discussions that are realistic, that are about understanding that we do have organized. Organizations of the working class like trade unions, we do have the beginnings of mass movements in things like People's Assembly, things like Enough is Enough. It's how we bring those together and point those at the task is the important thing. And we cannot possibly do that by just waiting for a Labour government to be elected. We have to take on the government that we have, but I think they are take-onable if we can grasp the nettle and have those real discussions, as opposed to just hectoring people that they should be buying oat milk rather than cow's milk, because that is not the way forward at all. Okay, so I am going to stop myself there. Ed, you've got your hand up, so go for it.
Yeah, it's quite a lot to respond to there, but I just picked out a couple of things, which was one thing was my experience of trying to organise on climate with Labour for a Green New Deal was that we didn't, or it was very difficult to work with the trade unions, and just in terms of, I think, trade union capacity. So you'd find someone in the trade union movement who was kind of interested sort of in climate, but then they were always doing so many different things that they didn't really have the time to focus on it. So we never really got a huge amount of trade union buy-in when we were trying to organise so far. So I'll be definitely interested in keeping in touch with yourself going forward to try and keep that link going and work with trade unions going forward. In terms of, just, I guess the only other thing I was just thinking, which doesn't really relate to a lot of what you covered, but I guess just to that last point, which is this idea that we're kind of hectoring people about about choices they should make, lifestyle choices. And I kind of feel like it's not necessarily hectoring just to give people information about what is a kind of low carbon and a high carbon choice. Necessarily, it doesn't have to be hectoring anyway. You can just be like, we're letting you make that decision. Although I do appreciate a lot of choices that people get offered. They're either very, very expensive or very time consuming to try and do the right thing, as it were. But it's just to push back a little bit on what Matt referred to as climate guilt, which I kind of feel like, I think a lot of it isn't climate guilt, it's climate rationality. So if you know that flying produces a lot of carbon emissions and you say, well, I'm not going to fly because that's not guilt, that's just a a reasonable decision. So yeah, like I don't fly personally. I haven't flown for a long time. I don't feel guilty about it. I guess if I flew, I'd feel guilty, but because I don't fly, I don't feel guilty. So, but it's a rational choice. It's not. I guess if people are feeling guilty about flying, maybe they shouldn't fly. I don't know. But I guess it's the thing. It shouldn't be seen as a moral thing. It's just, for me, I see it as a rational response to the climate emergency. So I'll leave it there because we haven't got much time.
So, Matt, do you want to come back on that, or Jane, since we're talking about flying?
Yeah. Yeah, I think according to the WhatsApp, we only have like 5 minutes, so there's a lot I want to say. I agree, though, Ed. I don't think it should be a moral thing. I think one of the things I'm trying to get at is that there is a lot of moralizing around lifestyle choices in climate spaces, and that I agree. Like, if you want to make a rational argument, like this type of high carbon activity needs to be scaled down for these reasons, that's fine. But I'm an academic, and I see amongst my colleagues a lot of finger pointing, like if you're flying, you're bad. If you're not, you're good. It is very moralistic. And again, my main point is that if we want to change the carbon intensive nature of aviation, we got to take on aviation capital. We got to expropriate them. We got to regulate them. And in fact, if we're not flying, we found out during the pandemic that the aviation industry is very happy to fly those flights empty. So they don't care about the carbon impact of anything they're doing. So we have to take on their power if we want to change that system. And it is about power, as Elaine said, but I think as Ed was getting at, our path to state power is off the table, at least for the short beat. But I think we don't want to think about power simply as electoral power through the state, right? I keep bringing up this example in the United States where the West Virginia teachers went on strike and they shut down the entire state school system, created a major crisis in a Republican, or in your kind, it'd be like a Tory government, right? A right-wing government in power. They use their labor to use their power to create this crisis, force the political elites to respond to a set of demands, and they won their demands in about a couple weeks. So that's power, right? And just the threat of rail workers going on strike in the United States had the president and all the elites sort of scrambling to try to figure something out. So workers have power regardless of who's in the state, right? And I think when a left-wing or working class movement's not able to capture state power, we need to realize that workers still have a lot of power just in their labor, the fact that they do the work and they can withhold it, right? If I have time, I'll just say one more thing. I totally agree with Elaine. And just to say, Elaine, thank you so much for the very thoughtful and generous review of your book. It was really well written and well thought out. I agree with Elaine that we need to think bigger about our energy solutions. There's too much discussion of like decentralized, small scale, microgrids, community energy. I mean, if we're going to decarbonize at the scale and speed, we need big, large scale investment. We need so I wrote an article for Jacobin called In Defense of the Tennessee Valley Authority that calls for something called big public power, that we need to think back to like the New Deal where, they electrified the entire countryside in about 15 years. And they did big projects, big public investments, and built hydroelectricity. And in fact, we can look, I'm not going to get into the technological choices that they made because it's polarizing. But if you want to look at like the fastest paths of decarbonization, it happened by big publicly owned government investment in places like France and Sweden. And it happened pretty rapidly over the course of about 15 years. So I think we have to think much bigger. And if you have a little solar farm in your community, it's not going to solve this planetary crisis. It needs to be coordinated, needs to be large scale, and it needs to also, as Elaine said, not just decarbonize, but deliver cheaper energy to the working class who's struggling to afford this electricity. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so I just wanted to say briefly about aviation. This was something that someone said to me in a meeting that I was doing sort of against some aviation about 15 years ago now. And she said, well, I come from a really working class family. No one in my family has ever had enough money to go abroad on holiday. We've just finally got to the point where we can. And now you're saying to me that we can't. And this is the thing. I think those of us who have been relatively well off and have been able to fly around, it's easy for us to say, oh, well, I won't do that again. I'm not saying that that's you personally yet, but I think there's a lot of discussion around this that sounds like that. And people who never have been able to, or people who have family who live a long way away. I mean, again, it's easy enough for me. My parents live 100 miles away. If my parents lived a couple of thousand miles away, the argument would be a bit different. I think there's a justice thing there, that we can't simultaneously have a system that says basically you are not a valuable person if you don't travel a lot and you don't have all these wide experiences, but we're now not going to let you. Then that's a problem. We do have to think of a way of making access to the world just while we accept obviously the enormous damage that aviation does, and that we've got to find a way of dealing with that. Whether that's things like saying, okay, well, we give everyone a lot more annual leave so that they can take longer trips and to take international train trips or something like that. We can't just say, okay, we're going to cut down on this and therefore ration it by price, because that's just unjust, and people are not going to join a mass movement that says to them, you can't go on holiday to the sun anymore. But Jane, I'm sure you have views on this.
Well, I feel a bit marginalised out of this because I've not been so political, but how do you engage with the community? And that's what we're doing in our campaign and raising awareness. And I disagree the fact that people's small micro actions don't help them in kind of understanding the crisis that we're in. I mean, one of the ways, the main way was the loss of land, the loss of access, a community resource, a resource of the people of Liverpool for open spaces. And then we had an involvement with MedAct. We talked about pollution, and we had doctors there. Now we've engaged a lot of a very deprived community that was quite politically apathetic, and because of that particular thing about the Oglet, this is what we'll be fighting for. It's raised awareness of things like climate change, of things like, the damage to the planet that a small minority of people, not the people you're talking about, Elaine, who could have, go to Spain once a year, the tiny minority that do the damage that take like 95% of the flights. But I do think that small things help with this overwhelming pessimism. I can't do anything about it. There can only be political change. And a lot of people in places like Speak have got no faith in their councillors. They've betrayed them, no faith in their MPs. So what we're trying to do is to get them to kind of raise awareness of what they can do, give them power. And we've identified an enemy with Peel. We're going on picket lines. We're trying to support people who are taking political action. Anyway, I just sort of think that small actions raise awareness. And that's what we need with the working class. And that's what we've got in our campaign. I think we've got support from people in Speak. Okay.
Thank you, Jane. I think you're right, and I think it depends on what those small actions are, because I think you're right that the radicalizing effect of being involved in a campaign, even if it's a very local campaign, that can be really transformational for people, because you realise that you don't just have to put up with something that's happening in your locality. You can actually take action against it, and then that does open people's eyes up to, well, actually, if we've got the power to change the council's mind on this specific small issue, then we can do it on other things. So I think that's really important. I think the problem with small actions in climate change has been so often that it's about, therefore, what product you buy, and that doesn't have that same radicalizing effect. And I think it can make people feel pretty cynical, particularly if the product they're supposed to buy is always more expensive or harder to get, or I think it just makes people feel like it's a con. And this is something that some people have said to me. I think it's something that people think quite widely, often in the third world. I've had people say to me who come from particularly a friend of mine comes from Iran, which isn't really the third world, I know, but it's not the West. I'm saying that, it's all just, climate change is all just a Western conspiracy to keep non-Western countries down, because that's how they perceive it when it's being talked about in terms of this kind of it's about what you buy and so on. So I think that's the difference there between campaigns like yours and some of the kind of individual actions that I was criticising. But Ed, you got your hand up.
So yeah, just to come back on that, and I think maybe it relates to the kind of this question of power as well. So, I mean, I totally get what we need to, we need to build a power that challenges the powers that kind of hold things in place at the moment, but that is quite hard to do and beyond kind of the capacity of most people. So I think this is why people do take local actions, because they kind of go, okay, I have power in this place, in the kind of my locality, and I have my networks in this locality, and I can influence stuff here. So that's the kind of the choice that people make, and where they choose to invest their time and energy, which I think is, that's what I've chosen to do. I can't influence the climate on a global scale. I can only do what I can do in Liverpool and Liverpool City region. That's the kind of scale where I kind of feel comfortable trying to make an impact. And also just to again, I don't want to kind of bang on about flying and stuff, but in my carbon literacy training, which is say mine, there's a carbon literacy project that run it and accredit it and stuff. It does look at individual carbon footprints, but my training is very clear that individual action there's a very kind of clear boundary and a limit to individual action, and then we have to look at collective action, because individual action doesn't cut the mustard. Do you know what I mean? Or can only go so far, or people don't have the power or the money or the time to make the change in their lives that make the big difference. So when you look at people's carbon footprints, you can see that most of the carbon emissions come from their homes, heating and powering their homes, and from transport. So that's what like, okay, you probably individuals can't afford, most of the individuals in the UK can't afford to retrofit their houses up to a good standard and put solar panels on the roof. And they can't change the transport system themselves. That's a collective response that's needed there. So that's hopefully what they get out of it. So it is an education process of going like, yeah, this is what we need to do. We can't do it as individuals. We need a collective response.
It's not just a collective response, it's a non-market response. I mean, the retrofitting is a really good example, because when you look at, the options that are available for heating, for home heating, for heat pumps and so on, they are overwhelmingly things that need a lot of space, because after all, these are developed in a market, and the people who have the money to put the heat pumps in tend to be people who have larger houses, and therefore they have lots of space. So those are the solutions that exist. The solutions for cramped one-bedroom flats don't by and large exist, really. I know there's district heating, but as an individual, because that isn't the market. So it's not just that, we all need to club together and have a way of funding this for people. Actually, we need a non-market sort of product development, really. And so until you have some sort of national government, paying for this and organising this, that's not really going to happen. It needs to get out of the market system. I mean, I know what you mean also about the sort of local action, but I think any action against the government is always going to be, even against the government, is always going to happen locally. You do your local stall to build for the national demo and so on, because you can't, not everyone can march to Westminster immediately and overthrow the Tories, although it'd be nice if we could immediately. But I think the problem with kind of thinking, okay, well, what I can do is local, is when therefore you have local campaigns that only look at what can be managed locally. So I'm thinking about local campaigns that I'm involved with in North London, and we're having an argument at the moment about what we should focus on. And the argument is around, well, should we only look at things that the council can control? And the problem is that the council can control very little. There isn't actually very much that they can do. So you end up having all of this campaign, all of this energy that's about then where the energy comes from for the council's buildings. And really, so what? If we limit ourselves to having only that local horizon, then we're limiting ourselves to not doing very much sometimes. Again, I'm not saying that that's what you're doing in Liverpool at all, Ed, but I think that's my experience of the campaigns I'm involved in. Matt, do you want to come back on any of that?
Yeah, I think there can be lots of local struggles that are about building power. I'm in the US, I'm part of the Democratic Socialists of America, and I can think of countless campaigns that they've waged, like local citywide minimum wage, raising the minimum wage, which actually is a power struggle between like the kind of local small business class versus the working class. And so you can win these local struggles. And even, there's probably ways in which to try to get your city government to maybe invest in things like retrofitting houses and the things that need to happen. But there's other types of local actions which you could say are really not building power in any sort of way. There's a political theorist, Jody Dean, who has this funny line where she says, Goldman Sachs doesn't care if you raise chickens. And she's trying to call out this idea that if we're actually like building like a small garden or a small solar co-op community amongst largely middle-class affluent people, like what is that actually doing to build and challenge the people that really run our society and control our society? So that's, I think, maybe distinguishing between different kinds of local actions could be helpful. If I could go back to a little, we talked before about just transition, trade unions, and things like this. I have a lot to say here. Something Ed mentioned before, though, is that the trade unions weren't really involved with the labor organizing for a Green New Deal. And this is something that when you hang out with a climate left, you constantly hear that the trade unions are either not interested or they're not involved or they're and so forth. And oftentimes they're hostile to decarbonization, right? And that's a problem. But I think, and then in the United States, a lot of these trade unions are conservative, that they could even support Donald Trump and things like this. So there's a tendency to kind of write off the trade unions, particularly in the building trades and in the electricity sector and in the energy sector, the very sector that we have to transform. And I think, again, trying to move away from a kind of moralistic politics that talks about these workers are bad or problematic, and towards a more structural analysis of who has the power in our society. I think we have to recognize if we want to build a new energy system, we can't simply ignore the workers that are right in the belly of that beast that we need to transform. And if they're not willing to talk to us, we need to be able to build power in ways that force them to talk to us. And again, I've just learned DSA or Democratic Socialists have built so much power in the legislature to actually force some of the unions to actually have to talk to them because they have allies in power, and so therefore they can't ignore them anymore. So if you build power, the unions will have to talk to you. And the last thing is a just transition talk is often it's a lot of sloganeering, but a lot of the workers in these industries don't really believe that there's anything like a just transition for them because, coal communities and communities that rely on fossil fuel, they see unemployment and just economic devastation. And so the person who coined the term just transition is a labor union activist and environmentalist named Tony Mazzocchi. And his model for a just transition was what in the United States we did to transition workers from the war economy in World War II to the civilian economy, called the GI Bill, and it gave veterans like guaranteed income supports and free education to actually allow them to transition. So if we actually had that kind of real program that would actually totally make those workers whole and give them the material basis from which they could transition, maybe they would start to believe that there is even something like that. But ultimately, the just transition kind of views workers as these kind of victims that need to be kind of taken care of and But of course, what we're arguing for here is that the workers can be more of an agent of transformation and a powerful force in this fight. So I think we kind of have to transition to see them in that light as well, not just the sort of victims that we have to take care of.
That's right. So, Ed, I know you have to go. So, do you have any final words before you shoot off?
And the final words are just in terms of the quote that Matt said about from Jodie Dean. Was that Jodie Dean? Yeah. So, I mean, it reminds me of that one from I don't know who said it, but it's like environmentalism without class consciousness is just gardening. So that one's very kind of similar idea. I think we agree on most things here. We're agreeing on. I haven't given up on the trade unions. I just kind of we did our Green New Deal stuff, and then obviously things have been a bit chaotic for the last couple of years. I'm still in contact with these trade union people that I was in contact with, and I'm hopefully going to do more work with them. So yeah, that's kind of where I'd want to put more energy if I do have the chance and the opportunity. So I haven't given up on them. And I'm not judging them.
Thanks, Ed. So, Jane, do you want any last words from you?
Very briefly, because I know the next meeting is waiting. I just read something by Annie Proulx in her new book, and just blames a lot of this on Judeo-Christian belief that the world is there to exploit us, and capitalism as a result from that. But just a last observation for me about power to working class people. We've got two largely uneducated, Kerry and Denny from Speak, and another woman from Speak and me. They were so pissed off about our action that about 10 suits from Peel, the airport, came to meet us, and their hands were shaking. So individual action against local abuses or local theft of resources does raise awareness and does empower people, because I've seen it happen. And they're three really active people in our movement who've never been active before. Okay, thanks.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Jane. All power to your campaign. And I think that illustrates what I would say to sum up, that it can be in a local way, it can be in a really small way, but we can't believe that we can bring down capitalism by just ignoring it. It's not like the schoolyard bully. It won't go away if we pretend it's not there. You can't hollow it out by just withdrawing yourself from it. You have to take it on, and that can be at the very local level over very local issues, but all of that builds up to the big fight that we have to have. And I think as your anecdote really shows, that we can scare them. We do have power, and actually I think often the ruling class believes that more than we do, because after all they put into so much effort into convincing us that we don't, but we do, and it is eminently possible to build a mass movement that will force even Liz Truss to do what she really doesn't want to do, but what has to be done on the climate. We just have to believe that we can, and all work together to do so. So I think the next meeting is waiting to start. So I think that's probably where we should end it. So thanks very much to Ed and to Jane and to Matt and to everyone watching. Bye everybody.